Before you eat breakfast tomorrow morning, something important is already happening inside your body. Long before food touches your mouth, your metabolism is making decisions. Decisions about blood sugar. Decisions about inflammation. Decisions about whether fat will be stored or released. Most people believe fat loss begins with food. From a biological standpoint, that is not true. Fat loss begins before you eat. And this distinction matters most when we talk about the most dangerous type of fat in the human body, visceral fat. Visceral fat is not the fat you can pinch. It is not the fat you see in the mirror. It is the fat that forms deep inside the abdomen, wrapping itself tightly around vital organs such as the liver, the pancreas, and the intestines. From a medical perspective, visceral fat behaves very differently from surface fat. It is metabolically active. It releases inflammatory chemicals directly into the bloodstream. It interferes with insulin signaling. And over time, it quietly increases the risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and even certain cancers. What makes visceral fat dangerous is not how it looks. It is how it behaves. And that same biological behavior makes it highly sensitive to timing, especially the hours before breakfast. During the night, while you sleep, your body naturally enters a fasting state. Blood sugar levels slowly decline. Insulin levels fall. Inflammatory signaling begins to calm, assuming nothing disrupts the process. This is not a diet strategy. This is fundamental human physiology. In the early morning hours, the body is primed for metabolic decision-making. It is deciding whether to conserve stored energy or begin releasing it. And visceral fat is listening closely. Yet most people unknowingly disrupt this process before breakfast ever begins. They rush through the morning. They activate stress responses. They consume the wrong signals. And the body reacts defensively. When stress hormones rise, particularly cortisol, visceral fat receives a very clear message. Preserve energy. Protect reserves. Do not release fat. This is one reason so many people eat carefully, exercise consistently, and still struggle with stubborn belly fat. The problem is not discipline. The problem is biological timing. Scientific research shows that what happens before breakfast can influence how visceral fat behaves for the rest of the day. Not through force, but through signaling. Your immune system plays a role here. Your gut microbiome plays a role. Your vascular system plays a role. These systems do not operate in isolation. They communicate constantly. And in the early morning, that communication becomes especially influential. This is why researchers have become increasingly interested in pre-breakfast biological cues, signals that shape metabolism before calories ever enter the system. One of the most powerful signals does not come from food quantity, but from food chemistry. Certain natural compounds communicate with the body without adding significant calories. They interact with immune cells. They influence gene expression. They regulate inflammation and blood sugar response. Among the most studied of these compounds are polyphenol. Polyphenol are bioactive molecules found in specific plant-based beverages. They are not nutrients in the traditional sense. They behave more like biological messengers. When consumed before breakfast, polyphenol do something remarkable. They help prepare the metabolic environment. They reduce inflammatory signaling within visceral fat tissue. They improve insulin sensitivity before glucose enters the bloodstream. They influence angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels that visceral fat depends on in order to grow. Visceral fat requires a strong blood supply to survive and expand. When angiogenesis is excessive, fat tissue thrives. When angiogenesis is regulated, fat tissue becomes vulnerable. This is one reason visceral fat responds differently than fat stored under the skin. It is biologically dependent. Polyphenol help regulate this dependency without damaging healthy tissue. They do not starve the body. They do not shock metabolism. They guide it. Another critical pathway involves the gut microbiome. During the overnight fasting window, gut bacteria shift their activity. Some species become more active. Others quiet down. Polyphenols selectively nourish beneficial microbes, bacteria associated with improved insulin sensitivity and lower inflammation. These microbes produce metabolites that communicate directly with fat tissue and the liver. And this communication happens before breakfast, which means the first signal of the day matters more than most people realize. This is why researchers consistently observe the same pattern. Waist circumference often decreases before body weight changes. Internal fat responds first, not because calories were aggressively reduced, but because the internal environment changed. An environment is everything when it comes to visceral fat. This is not about skipping breakfast. This is not about deprivation. And this is not about extreme fasting. It is about sending the right biological message before eating. A calm signal instead of a stress signal. A regulatory signal instead of a spike. A message that tells visceral fat it is safe to let go. This is where one simple morning action becomes powerful. Not because it burns fat directly, but because it changes the conversation between your biology and stored fat. And when that conversation changes, visceral fat begins to respond. Quietly, gradually, and effectively. To understand why this simple morning window matters so much, we need to look deeper, beyond habits, beyond calories, and into how the body measures health. Most people rely on body weight to judge progress. They step on a scale. They watch the number rise or fall. And they assume that number tells the full story. Biologically, it does not. Weight alone cannot distinguish between muscle, water, surface fat, or the most dangerous fat of all, visceral fat. From a scientific standpoint, where fat is stored matters far more than how much fat exists. Visceral fat accumulates deep within the abdomen. It surrounds vital organs. And as it grows, it begins to interfere with their function. This is why clinicians often pay closer attention to waist circumference than to body weight. Waist size is a far more accurate reflection of visceral fat accumulation. As visceral fat expands, it places physical and biochemical stress on organs such as the liver and pancreas. The liver becomes less efficient at regulating blood sugar and cholesterol. The pancreas struggles to release insulin in a controlled and effective way. Over time, this creates a metabolic environment that favors fat storage rather than fat release. What is remarkable, however, is how quickly this environment can begin to change when visceral fat is reduced, even modestly. Studies consistently show that when visceral fat decreases, organ function improves. Blood sugar regulation stabilizes. Inflammatory signaling declines. Metabolism becomes more flexible. And importantly, these improvements often occur before significant weight loss is visible on the scale. This is why so many people experience a reduction in waist size before seeing dramatic changes in body weight. Internal health improves first. This also explains why the scale can be misleading. Positive metabolic changes are often invisible at the beginning. Now, let's return to the role of polyphenol-rich beverages. These compounds do not act on a single pathway. They influence multiple biological systems simultaneously. One of the most important involves blood sugar regulation. After meals, sharp spikes in blood glucose trigger large insulin responses. Repeated over time, this pattern encourages visceral fat storage. Polyphenol helps soften this response. They blunt post-meal glucose spikes. They reduce excessive insulin release. Lower insulin levels send a different message to fat tissue. A message that stored energy can be accessed rather than locked away. Visceral fat, being metabolically active, responds quickly to this shift. Another critical factor is timing. Consuming these compounds earlier in the day, before breakfast, allows them to shape the metabolic response to the meals that follow. However, timing alone is not enough. Consistency matters more. Biology responds to repeated signals, not occasional ones. Inflammation does not resolve overnight. The gut microbiome does not shift in a single day. Daily intake creates a steady biological rhythm. An ongoing conversation between the body and its environment. This is why occasional use produces weaker effects. The signal is inconsistent. The response is muted. There is also an important consideration often overlooked: added sugars. When sugar is added, insulin rises sharply. Inflammation increases. And many of the metabolic benefits are diminished. Consumed without sugar, the biological message remains clear and focused. Over time, something important begins to happen. Inflammation decreases. Insulin sensitivity improves. Energy levels stabilize. And gradually visceral fat begins to reduce. Not dramatically. Not aggressively. But consistently. This approach does not rely on drastic change. It relies on alignment with biology. The body is not being forced into fat loss. It is being guided toward balance. 1 cup per day becomes a reliable signal. A message repeated often enough that the body begins to trust it. And when the body trusts the signal, it responds. Visceral fat, in particular, responds to changes in its environment. Change the environment and fat behavior changes. This is the quiet power of what happens before breakfast. Not through restriction. Not through stress. But through cooperation with the body's natural systems. To truly appreciate why this approach works, we need to move beyond surface explanations and look at what science has revealed over the past 2 decades. Not anecdotes. Not traditions. But controlled, peer-reviewed research. Across multiple studies, Researchers have observed a consistent relationship between polyphenol intake and reductions in visceral fat. What makes these findings compelling is not the size of the calorie deficit, but the way metabolism is regulated. This is not about burning more calories. It is about changing how the body decides where energy is stored. One of the most important mechanisms involves chronic inflammation. Visceral fat thrives in an inflammatory environment. Inflammation signals fat cells to hold on to energy, not release it. When inflammatory markers remain elevated, fat tissue becomes resistant. It stops responding to normal metabolic cues. Polyphenol help interrupt this cycle. They reduce inflammatory signaling within visceral fat tissue. As inflammation declines, fat cells begin to behave differently. They become metabolically flexible. Metabolic flexibility means the body can switch efficiently between storing energy and releasing it. It is a hallmark of metabolic health. Another critical mechanism involves angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels. Visceral fat depends on angiogenesis to grow. Without sufficient blood supply, fat tissue cannot expand or survive efficiently. Research shows that certain polyphenol help regulate angiogenesis. They do not block blood vessels indiscriminately. They selectively limit excessive vessel growth in unhealthy fat tissue while preserving circulation to vital organs. This selectivity is essential. It reflects biological intelligence rather than blunt intervention. By regulating angiogenesis, the body subtly reduces the support system that visceral fat depends on. The result is not immediate fat loss, but increased vulnerability of fat tissue to metabolic change. Another layer of this process involves the gut microbiome. The gut is not simply a digestive organ. It functions as a metabolic control center. Trillions of bacteria live within the digestive tract, producing compounds that influence insulin sensitivity, inflammation, and fat storage. Polyphenol act as selective fuel for beneficial bacteria. As these bacteria thrive, they produce metabolites that communicate directly with the liver and fat tissue. These signals improve insulin sensitivity and reduce fat storage cues. This is not a single pathway. It is a systems-level effect. Gut health, immune signaling, vascular regulation, and fat metabolism are interconnected. This interconnectedness explains why results appear gradual rather than dramatic. Biology prioritizes stability. Rapid change is often interpreted as stress. When weight loss occurs too quickly, stress hormones rise. Cortisol increases. And visceral fat responds defensively. This is why aggressive dieting often fails to reduce deep abdominal fat in the long term. Visceral fat resists under stress. A calmer metabolic environment produces better outcomes. This is where pre-breakfast signaling becomes especially important. Early-day biological cues help set the tone for the entire metabolic cycle. Sleep quality plays a role here as well. During sleep, the body performs repair work. Inflammation naturally decreases. Hormonal balance begins to reset. When sleep is disrupted, metabolic signaling suffers. Visceral fat becomes more resistant. Insulin sensitivity declines. Stress compounds this effect. Elevated cortisol promotes visceral fat storage. It shifts energy toward preservation rather than utilization. Polyphenol help counter oxidative stress at the cellular level. They support resilience rather than overstimulation. Cells protected from oxidative damage function more efficiently. Mitochondria, your cellular energy engines, work more cleanly. Efficient mitochondria burn fuel with less waste. Less excess energy is diverted toward visceral fat storage. This is why many people notice improvements in energy and mental clarity before visible fat loss occurs. The internal systems stabilize first. This approach does not replace healthy habits. It amplifies them. Movement, sleep, hydration, and nutrition all become more effective when biological signaling is aligned. One cup alone is not magic. But repetition creates momentum. Visceral fat responds to environment. Change the environment and fat behavior changes. This is how the body prefers to work. Quietly, gradually, effectively. At this point, one truth should be clear. Visceral fat does not respond well to force. It does not respond well to panic, restriction, or metabolic stress. It responds to environment. For years, the conversation around fat loss has focused almost entirely on effort. Eat less, move more, push harder. But biology tells a different story. The body is not a machine that responds best to pressure. It is a living system that responds best to signals. And visceral fat, more than any other type of fat, is sensitive to the signals it receives. This is why timing matters. This is why the period before breakfast is so influential. Before you eat, your body is listening. Your immune system is active. Your gut microbiome is adjusting. Your hormones are setting the tone for the day. In this quiet window, small inputs carry disproportionate weight. A calm signal tells the body that energy is available, that there is no immediate threat, that stored fat does not need to be fiercely protected. A stress signal does the opposite. This is the central mistake many people make. They begin the day with urgency, with stimulation, with spikes in cortisol, in blood sugar, and insulin. And visceral fat responds exactly as biology designed it to respond, by holding on. What science now shows is that a simple, consistent pre-breakfast action can shift this entire conversation. Not by burning fat directly, but by changing the context in which fat exists. Polyphenol-rich signaling works because it speaks the body's language. It reduces low-grade inflammation. It improves insulin sensitivity before glucose arrives. It regulates angiogenesis so visceral fat loses its growth advantage. It nourishes beneficial gut bacteria that reinforce metabolic balance. None of this happens dramatically. None of it needs to. Biology prefers subtlety. When signals are repeated day after day, the body adapts. Inflammation gradually declines. Hormonal noise quiets. Metabolic flexibility returns. And visceral fat, no longer under threat, begins to loosen its grip. This is why waist circumference often changes before body weight. Why internal health improves before external appearance. Why energy stabilizes before the mirror reflects change. These are not coincidences. They are predictable biological outcomes. This approach is not about skipping meals. It is not about extreme fasting. And it is not about chasing rapid results. It is about alignment. Alignment with circadian rhythms. Alignment with immune signaling. Alignment with the body's natural preference for stability over shock. When alignment is restored, the body does what it has always known how to do. It self-regulates. This is also why this strategy is sustainable. There is no metabolic debt to repay. No rebound driven by stress hormones. No biological resistance building beneath the surface. Instead, there is trust. The body begins to trust the signal. And when trust is established, cooperation follows. 1 cup before breakfast becomes more than a habit. It becomes a daily message. A message that says, there is no emergency. There is no scarcity. You can let go. And visceral fat listens. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But steadily. This is the kind of change that lasts. Not because willpower is infinite, but because biology is finally working with you instead of against you. The most powerful shifts in health rarely announce themselves loudly. They happen quietly beneath the surface, long before they are visible. And often they begin before breakfast,